wisdom.
What's up everyone, it's Blueberry here, and today I have a Commander build that was custom ordered in late July. The customer wanted a Commander version of the Death by Thopter 60 card pre-con style deck that I make and sell, and since I hadn't really thought to make it a Commander deck, I had to figure out what would make the best general for the idea. After some research, I came up with Sai, Master Thopterist. Sai is a 3-mana, 1/4 legendary human artificer with 2 abilities that fit perfectly for the job. The first ability is whenever you cast an artifact, you create a 1/1 flying Thopter token, which is exactly what this deck's theme is centered around. The second ability allows you to pay 1 blue and 1 generic mana and sacrifice 2 artifacts to draw a card. Since this deck revolves around getting things back to your hand or back from your graveyard to recast them, this ability may seem harmful at first, but trust me when I tell you, it's definitely more beneficial with the way that this deck runs. This style of deck is one of my favorite ways to play, and I hope the person who gets the deck enjoys it as well. So, enough rambling, let me show you what I put together for them on a just under $40 budget. So we're going to start with the lands like I like to do, and remember this is a budget mono blue deck, so it's not got money cards in it, but it's got some stuff that's useful, mostly basics, and then some things that help out artifacts. So we start with Phyrexia's Core, taps Static Colorless, comes into play untapped. You can pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice an artifact, and you gain 1 life, and that's useful because there are some artifacts that you want to go to the grave because we're going to loop them back around from the grave into the library, so keep that in mind when I describe a lot of the stuff going on. Foundry of the Consoles, comes into play untapped again, taps Static Colorless, and then you can pay 5, tap and sack it to put 2 1/1 colorless Thopter creature tokens in play. So you create 2 1/1 flying Thopter tokens. Tomb of the Spirit Dragon, taps for 1 colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it to gain a life for each colorless creature you control, and there are a bunch in here, so you can gain a lot of life off that. Buried Ruin, again, untapped, it comes into play, taps Static Colorless, and then you can pay 2 and tap it and sack it to return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Ghost Quarter, because by now you should know if you've seen enough of my videos, I like to include some kind of land destruction land in every deck that I build, because you just never know what you're going to run into, and you may need to remove a land. Evolving Wilds, and of course Terramorphic Expanse for some, taking lands out of your deck and putting them into play. It thins out, it makes the draws better. It thins out your deck and makes your draws better. And then again, the rest are islands. I think it's 28 islands, but you can take a look at the deck list in the description. You can see exactly how many there were. The ramp section was pretty simple. It's got a little bit more than I usually put in. I usually put about 7 or so in. This one's got 9. We start off with Mind Stone. It's 2 to cast, taps to add a colorless. Doesn't come into play tapped, which is important. And then you can pay 1, tap and sack it to draw a card. And remember, we're looping things back into our library from our graveyard, so that could be used multiple times. Sky Diamond, 2 to cast. Unfortunately, it does come into play tapped, but at least it taps to add a blue. Felwar Stone, 2 to cast, doesn't come into play tapped, and you can tap to add a mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. And since a lot of people like to play blue in Commander, it works. Seer's Lantern, 3 to cast, taps Static Colorless, doesn't come into play tapped, and then you can pay 2, tap and scry 1, and scrying is the next best thing to drawing a card. I've said it a couple times. If you can't draw a card, you can at least set up your next draw. Hedron Archive, 4 to cast, comes into play untapped, and then you can tap it to add 2 colorless, and then you can pay 2, tap and sack it to draw 2 cards, and again, remember we can loop that back in later. There's a couple ways to do so, and I'll show you them in a little bit. Mycosynth Wellspring, this is one of the centerpieces to the Death by Thopter deck that I had, that they wanted this deck based around. So it's 2 to cast when it comes into play, or is put into your graveyard from the battlefield. You may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it in your hand, and then shuffle. And this will also be one of those things where if you can return it to your hand, and then play it again, so you can get a Thopter token, or if it goes to the graveyard, and then you can get it back into your hand another way, it's got multiple uses. Skittering Surveyor is a 3 to cast 1/2, and when it enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic land card, reveal, put it in your hand. Again, gets more lands out of your library into your hand, and at least you won't draw it later. Wildfield Scarecrow, 3 to cast 1/4 with Defender. At least it has a big butt so it can defend a little bit better. And then you can also pay 2 and sack it to search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand, and then shuffle, obviously. So, again, more stuff to get lands out of your library into your hand, or some of them into play, like this one, Burnished Heart, and then you can go ahead and get better draws later. So this one's a 3 to cast 2/2. You can pay 3 and sack it to search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, and then put them onto the battlefield, tapped. So, all good stuff to get lands out of your deck, to have repeatable ways to get land either into play, by looping them back into your library. Moving on to the creatures, this is the largest section of the deck. It's actually, I think it's 40% of the deck. And a lot of them are going to be artifact creatures. This section is literally just the artifact creatures, and there's a small section of non-artifact creatures. Because everything in this deck is based around artifacts, this is how it built out. And remember, we're sort of a combat-based deck, so we're going to be attacking with Thopters, but to get those Thopters, you have to have other things cast, so this is how we did it, and I'll show you everything now. I want a Thopter because this is a Thopter deck, and I wanted that to be like the main theme, so there's a couple Thopters in here. This is the first one. Iron Apprentice is a 1 to cast 0/0 that enters play with a +1/+1 counter, and then when it dies, if it had counters on it, you can put them on target creature you control. Monoscalion is a 2 to cast 1/1 that comes in play with a +1/+1 counter, and then you can pay 1 and remove a +1/+1 counter from it to deal 1 damage to any target, and there are ways to put counters on it. Obviously, we just had the Iron Apprentice, and there's other ways, and I'll show you that in just a second. Patchwork Automaton is a 2 cast 1/1. It has Ward 2, so it has some protections. And then whenever you cast an artifact spell, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it doesn't go onto the Monoscallion, but at least it has counters that goes with it. But the Steel Overseer, that will put counters on everything. It's a 2 cast 1/1 that literally just taps to put a +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature you control. So that'll help put counters on Monoscallion, so you can start actually doing some damage with it if you need to. Mirror Retriever is a 2 cast 1/1 that when it dies, you can return a artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. And there's a couple other ways you can do that in this deck as well. With that, Malcator's Watcher is a 2 cast 1/1 flyer with Vigilance that when it dies, you can draw a card. So it's leave the battlefield, or dies in this case because it's not leaves play. When it dies, you can do that, and then there are ways again to get it back. Ethereum Sculptor is a 2 cast 1/2 that makes all your artifacts cost 1 less to cast. There are 3 to 4 of these kinds of cards in here to make a lot of your stuff cheaper, and even in some instances free, so you can loop some things even more. And I started to show you the first part of it, which is not that card, sorry, which was the Mirror Retriever, and you'll see another one like that, so you can loop them together and be able to cast them for free if you can come up with a sack outlet that is free. It doesn't currently have a free one in here. It has a couple of other ways you can sack creatures or artifacts, but for the time being, this was on a just under $40 budget, so I couldn't include some of the cards that it needed that would be free sack outlets. Workshop Assistant, that's the other version of a card that brings an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. It's a 3 cast 1/2 that does that, and it helps loop. So if you've got 3 things that reduce the cost of things, you can loop them for free. If you have a sack outlet that's free, you can even create infinite mana if you have something like an Ashnod's Altar or a Phyrexian Altar. Again, those are way more budget than this deck was. Foundry Inspector, it's the 3 cast 3/2 version of the thing I was talking about earlier that makes artifacts cost 1 less to cast, and there's at least one more in here. Chief of the Foundry is the Anthem creature. It's a 3 cast 2/3 that gives all artifact creatures +1/+1. Shambling Suit is a 3 cast star 3, and the star is equal to the number of artifacts and or enchantments you control. There are like maybe 1 or 2 enchantments in here, so it's mostly going to count your artifacts. Sky Scanner was fitting the Thopter theme. It's a 3 cast 1/1 flyer that when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and you can return it back to your hand with something I'm going to show you in a little, not a couple cards down. You can return it to your hand, and you can play it again over and over again, or you can get it back from your graveyard in other ways. Shimmer Mirror, 3 cast 2/2 with Flash, and it makes all your artifacts be able to be cast as if though they had Flash. So it doesn't give them Flash, but it makes them able to be cast as if though they had Flash, so you can cast them at instant speed. Acquisition Octopus is a 3 cast 2/2 that has Reconfigure 2 because it is an artifact, equipment / creature octopus. So it itself has whenever it deals damage to a player, you draw a card, or you can equip it to something so that when it deals damage to a player, you can draw a card. Covert Technician is a 3 cast 2/4 with Ninjutsu. And then whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may put an artifact card from your hand with mana value less than or equal to the amount of damage done onto the battlefield. So at its current state, as a 2/4, if it deals 2 damage, you can put an artifact that costs 2 or less into play for free. Esperzo is the card I was mentioning just earlier about returning stuff back to your hand. It's a 3 cast 4/3. This was a centerpiece for the Death by Thopter deck because returning stuff to your hand and playing it again helps put more Thopters into play. So it's a 4/3 flyer. At the beginning of your upkeep, return an artifact you control to its owner's hand. So you can see how that works. It should be a downfall. It's actually a benefit to you in this deck. Unctus Grand Meditect is a 3 cast 2/4. Other creatures you control have, whenever this creature becomes tapped, you draw a card and discard a card, so you can cycle through. You can drop lands that you don't need if they're extra to draw better answers. Other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1, so it's another Anthem effect, so it gives all your artifacts a buff statically. And then it has for a Phyrexian mana, which is to pay either a blue or 2 life, until the turn target creature you control becomes a blue artifact in addition to its other types. You're probably not going to use that often, but it is there if you need it. Joyra's Familiar is a 40 cast 2/2. It is one of the other cards that reduces the cost of your artifacts, but it does a couple more. It's a flyer, and then historic spells cost 1 less to cast, which is to say that artifacts, legendaries, and sagas are historic, so they all cost 1. So that includes your commander, and there is going to be 1 saga in here, and there are a couple of other legendary creatures in here. But it doesn't just mean legendary creatures, that includes planeswalkers and anything that has a legendary super type. Tawashi Guidebot is a 40 cast 2/1. When it enters play, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature that you control, and then you can pay 4 and tap it to draw a card, but this ability has you can make it cost less for each artifact, or I'm sorry, modified creature that you control. Remember that there are some things in there that come into play with counters, and there's also the thing that puts +1/+1 counters on all of your artifact creatures, so essentially you can make this so you can just tap it to draw a card. So it's nice and cheap and repeatable card draw. Snare Thopter fits the theme of the deck. It's a Thopter. It's a 40 cast 3/2 with Flying and Haste. It's in here purely for flavor. Fairy Mechanist is a 40 cast 2/2 flyer that when it enters play, you look at the top 3 cards of your library, and then you may reveal an artifact from among them, put it in your hand, and then put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Transplant Theorist is a 40 cast 2/4 that when it or another artifact enters the battlefield under control, you may draw a card, and then if you do, you discard a card. So you can cycle through your deck to find answers. And then this is another way you can get some stuff from the graveyard back into your library, and you will be shuffling that library with one of the cards I show you in a little bit. For 2, you can put the target card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. And it's any card. It doesn't have to be an artifact. It just has to be, you have to be able to target your graveyard. Filigree Attendant is a 4-cast star 3 flyer, and the star is equal to the number of artifacts you control, akin to the other one that had the same ability. Sharding Sphinx was also one of the centerpieces of the Death by Thopter deck. It is a 6-cast 4/4 flyer that whenever an artifact creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may create a 1/1 blue Thopter artifact creature token with flying. That, when I read it, it's a lot of words. Basically, whenever anything that's an artifact creature that you control deals combat damage, you create a 1/1 Thopter token also. It's not every time any of them, I'm sorry, let me repeat that. It's not for each, like, it's each instance. So if you have 5 Thopters from making them from using Psi, if they all attack and they all hit different people or even the same person, you get to draw for each instance that happens. So that's 5 cards you get to draw. It was a very big centerpiece in the Death by Thopter deck. Meteor Golem was a last-minute inclusion before the film. I actually looked at the card a little harder. It's a 7-cast 3/3 that when it enters play, you can destroy a non-land permanent and opponent controls. I wasn't going to include this until I realized I can loop these cards back in or return it to my hand to cast again, and even at a reduced cost if you have the right situation going on, and you can just start destroying people's stuff. And blue doesn't have a lot of removal except for returning stuff to people's hands, not actual destruction, so that was pretty cool that I wanted that in there. And then the last creature that's an artifact is Spotter Thopter. It's an 8-cast 4/5 flyer that when it enters play, you can scry X, where X is its power. But the cool thing is it has prototype, meaning that you can cast it for 4 instead, and it's a 2/3 version of itself. So not bad stuff there. It's good flavor. The rest of the creatures are going to basically help aid the artifact theme of the deck. So Glint Nest Crane, it's a 2-cast 1/3 flyer. When it enters play, look at the top 4 cards of your library, and you may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it in your hand and put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So it helps get you stuff in your hand that you need. Emery, Lurker of the Loch, or the Lady in the Lake, if you know what it's based off of. It's a 30-cast 1/2 that costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. This card can also be your commander if you want to switch it out and have a small, different feel to it. And then when Emery enters the battlefield, you mill 4 cards, and then you can tap her to choose target artifact card in your graveyard, and then you may cast that card this turn. And yes, you have to pay any costs, but if you have cost reducers in play, it's whatever the reduced cost is. This is good for looping stuff back into play. It's what I said. A lot of these things loop back in so that you can cast them again and get benefit from them. Whirler Rogue is a 4-cast 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creatures with flying, and then you can tap 2 untapped artifacts you control to have target creature become unblockable for the rest of the turn. That's important because if you want to get some damage through, he can help you do it. Replication Specialist was pretty cool. It's a 5-cast 3/4 flyer. Whenever a non-token artifact enters the battlefield, not cast, that's important. Whenever a non-token artifact enters the battlefield you under your control, you may pay 1 blue and 1 generic, and if you do, you create a token that's a copy of that artifact. So now you can actually cast things or put things into play, and then replicate them is the easiest term I can do, but you're copying them, and make multiple copies of them, and then they may have huge benefits down the road. Steelfin Whale is a 6-cast 3/4 with affinity for artifacts, which means that it costs 1 generic less for each artifact you control. And then whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, you can untap Steelfin Whale. There is some synergies that you can add to the deck later. Monetarily, they cost a little bit more, that you can go infinite with a Steelfin Whale in play. I don't have them there just because monetarily it doesn't make sense. This was just under $40 to build. So if that discussion needs to be had, you can send me a message. Next is Gear Seeker Serpent. It's a 7-cast 5/6. It costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control, which is affinity for artifacts, but it doesn't have the keyword for some reason. And then you can pay 6 to have it become unblockable for the rest of the turn. And the last creature is Junk Winder. It's a 7-cast 5/6 with affinity for tokens, so now it costs 1 less to cast generically. Only generic mana. It costs 1 less to cast for each token you control, and this deck is a token-generating deck, so most of the time you should be able to cast this for just 2 blue. And then whenever a token enters the battlefield under your control, you tap target non-land permanent and opponent controls, and it doesn't untap during its controller's next untap step. So this card can help lock down a lot of people's stuff. If you're, casting a lot of artifacts in a turn, this guy can help you get to where you need to go as far as getting damage in with attacks. The last section I'm going to go over is the utility section. It's going to include instants, sorceries, enchantments, artifacts, sagas, if you will, stuff that is utilitarian for the deck, that fits the theme of artifacts, and I'm going to split it up into 3 sections. We're going to start off with card draw, then we're going to do counter magic, and then pure utility. So, card draw. Perilous Research is a 2-cast instant that lets you draw 2 cards, and then you have to sacrifice a permanent. This deck actually doesn't mind sacrificing certain things, so it's actually a pretty cheap card draw spell, just because you can... one of the Microsynth Wellsprings or whatever have you is on the field that doesn't do anything when it's on the field. Sacrificing so you can get it back to your hand and then cast it later, or even using Emery is a benefit, not a downfall. Forging the Anchor is a 3-cast sorcery that lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal any number of artifact cards from among them, and then put the revealed cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. We have another one just like this coming up. Thirst for Knowledge is a 3-cast instant that lets you draw 3 cards, then you have to discard 2 cards unless you control or discard an artifact card. Artificer's Epiphany is a 3-cast instant that lets you draw 2 cards, and then if you control no artifacts, you discard a card, and this deck will have enough artifacts that you'll just be drawing 2 cards. Thoughtcast is a 5-cast sorcery with affinity for artifacts that lets you draw 2 cards, so for the most part, you're probably going to be casting this for 1 blue.
Reality Heist is a 7 to cast instant, and the spell costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control, so not affinity for artifacts, but it pretty much is affinity for artifacts. So you can get it down to just 2 blue. You look at the top 7 cards of your library, you may reveal up to 2 artifact cards from among them, put them in your hand, and put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order, or I'm sorry, in a random order. Ichor Wellspring, it was another piece to the Death by Thopter deck that this is based off of. It's a 2 to cast artifact that when it enters play or is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. So you're casting it, you're either returning it to your hand from play using anything that bounces stuff, or you're returning it back to your library or casting it again with Embry so you can get multiple uses out of it with card draw. It's good utility. Same thing with Spare Supplies, only it does it a little differently. This is also 2 to cast. It enters play tapped, but when it enters play, you draw a card, and then you can sacrifice it to draw a card. So again, more looping that you can do with it to draw more cards. Same thing with Witching Well. It's 1 to cast. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 2, and then you can pay 4 to sacrifice it and draw 2 cards, and then you can loop that as well back in. Similar to that is Mnemonic Sphere. It's a 2 to cast artifact that you pay 2 and sack it to draw 2 cards, or you can channel it, which is that you have to pay 1 blue and discard it from your hand, and you can draw a card. Discarding it is not really a downside because you can get it back later. The use that you're looking for here, though, is to draw 2 cards because more resources is always better. And then the last card draw card is going to be Tamio's Logbook. It's a 3 to cast artifact that you have to pay 6 to draw a card, but the ability basically has affinity for artifacts, whereas it costs 1 less for each artifact you control. So you can get it down to 1 blue, and it's a repeatable card draw. Super good in this deck. Counter magic wise, I didn't do a lot with counter magic. I just wanted to be able to counter the stuff that needs to be countered so that your opponents can't win. Annul counters an artifact or enchantment spell for 1 blue. It's pretty good in Commander. I had it tested for a couple people who I put this in their deck, and it actually worked very well. Negate counters a non-creature spell for 2. Again, save this for when somebody's trying to go off and you can stop the card that wins them the game. Disdainful Stroke is kind of similar. It's 2 to cast. It counters any spell with converted mana cost 4 or greater. If somebody's winning with a 3 or less mana value creature or anything, I don't know what to tell you about that. Most of them are usually 4 or higher. So you're playing a numbers game here with that. It's 2 to cast, so that's why it's in there. Disruption Protocol is a 2 to cast instant that just counters target spell. There's an additional cost that you must pay where you have to tap an untapped artifact you control or pay 1 mana. There's enough artifacts that'll be in play with this deck that you shouldn't have to pay the 1 mana. Stoic Rebuttal is a 3 to cast instant that counters target spell as well. However, it costs 1 less to cast if you control 3 or more artifacts, so it's actually as good as counterspell in a deck like this. And then the final section is going to be just pure utility stuff. It's not a big section, but all these things will help for the deck's theory. Rebuild seems like an odd inclusion. It's a 3 to cast instant that returns all artifacts to their owner's hands, and it cycles for 2. If you don't know what cycling is, just ask me. I'll explain it even further in depth. The important part here is the card's name is apt. It's actually named Rebuild because this is actually a card that has dual purpose. You can either cast it when somebody casts a board wipe that wants to remove all artifacts to get them back, or if you just want to be able to cast more stuff to do more things, you can actually send them back to your hand with this card and then recast everything so you can reset up. So it's got a lot of uses. It seems like an odd inclusion, but it's actually a game saver sometimes. Efficient Construction is basically half of Psi. It's a 4 to cast enchantment that whenever you cast an artifact spell, you create a 1/1 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. So having double the tokens for having 1 artifact be cast is always good. So that's an auto-include pretty much. The Antiquity Wars actually is shocking to me. I actually looked at this card 100 times and I always pass it over. In this deck, it's a killer. So it's 4 to cast, it's a saga. So it comes into play with 3 chapters. When it comes into play, you always do the first chapter. On your next upkeep, you do the second chapter, and then on the upkeep after that, you do the third. So the first 2 chapters are the same. You get to look at the top 5 cards of your library, and then you may reveal an artifact card from among them and put it into your hand, and then put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. So it digs for the things you need twice. And then that 3rd chapter actually can be a game ender. It says artifacts you control become artifact creatures with base power and toughness of 5/5 until end of turn. So if you have like 20 1/1 little Thopter tokens on the battlefield, they're not doing much, but if you hit the 3rd chapter of this, now they become 5/5s, and that can be pretty scary. So this can actually end the game. Didn't think about that for a while because I haven't put together a deck that would use this, but when I finally did, that's a killer card. Elixir of Immortality is a 1 to cast artifact that you pay 2 and tap it. You gain 5 life, then you shuffle Elixir and your graveyard into your library. The original deck I built that was Death by Thopter that this is based on, this was the main theory of the deck, is to cast a lot of stuff, get a lot of stuff in your graveyard, and then loop it back in over and over because that deck had originally 4 Elixirs of Immortality in there, so you always had one either in play or in your hand to play. So you could keep doing that. And every time you did it, you were having less and less lands in the deck because you had ways to get it out of the deck, which is why the cards I chose for this deck get that many lands out. So this is a key part to this deck. It's Commander, so you can only have 1. And as far as the rest of the cards that do what this card does, they exile themselves, so they're not as good as the Elixir for what it needs to do. Really good part of this deck. It's key. The last card is something you should recognize all the time. I've been using this a lot lately. It's a way to protect your commander. It's a 2 to cast equipment called Mirror Shield that gives it +0/+2 and hexproof. I don't care about this line about Death Touch. Who cares about that? Giving Psi hexproof is quite important. He will be a target once people realize what's going on. So really key piece to actually keeping him alive. So trying to search for this card may be important for this deck.
So that's how I built Psy Master Thopterist for someone for just under $40. It has a lot of nifty little interactions that can lead to some surprise wins. With just a few small upgrades, this deck could become even more dangerous very quickly. As is though, piloting a horde of flying Thopters just seems like a lot of fun, and hopefully the new owner agrees. With all the different orders I've had lately, along with all the new precon style decks I'm making, it's hard to say what I will have for you next week, so I'll just say check back next week for more budget-friendly Magic goodness. As always, thanks for watching, and be sure to check out some of my previous deck build videos while you're waiting for new content.
If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, or concerns, or you just want to talk or chat about any of the videos I put out, you can do so using any of the methods I have displayed here. Additionally, if you would like to support the channel, you can do so in 3 ways. Donations are accepted and greatly appreciated. I have 3 methods with which you can do so displayed on the screen, and keep in mind that no amount is too small. If donations aren't your thing, and you would like to get something for your money, that's great too. I sell a lot of the decks I present on the channel, as well as mystery packs. So, if you're interested in any of these, you can contact me using the information I have up on your screen right now. Directly contacting me is usually the best and cheapest way to do so, but you can always look at what I currently have available on the Facebook Marketplace. And lastly, if you want to show your love and support for the channel, but like myself, are a little strapped for cash, it doesn't cost you anything to subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, watch some videos and give them a like, and possibly share them out on your social medias you use to help spread my content to more people. No matter what way you choose is greatly appreciated and will help support the channel, and I thank you for it. Sadly, that is all the time I have for this video. Thank you for watching, and please, stick around and watch some of the many great videos I've posted over the last few years, and remember to check back again for new content I'll be posting every week. Have a great day.